Welcome everyone to the First Avenue North-Billings virtual open house. My name is Sloan and I'm the communications manager for the project. Thank you so much for joining us today. So with me today are Thaddeus Lesnick, he's the project manager for MDT, Nick Pavia, the project manager for Sanderson Stewart, Ivan Alberg, the public involvement lead for Sanderson Stewart. Also on this call is my colleague Katie, who will be facilitating the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. If you have any questions at any time during the presentation, please feel free to write them down in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. It's like the little two speaking bubbles at the bottom of your screen, and we'll address them at the end of the presentation. All right. We will start today's presentation with an overview of the First Avenue North-Billings project, then outline the proposed improvements, talk a bit about the schedule, and construction, and we'll end with the Q&A session. So let's get started. I would like to introduce Ivan, who will give us an overview of the project and the proposed improvements.
Thank you, everybody, for attending. For those of you that weren't able to attend yesterday's meeting, we had a really good on-site in-person meeting, and we had some good questions and good comments on the project, and hopefully this will be as helpful to you as it was to the folks that came yesterday. So the project location is obviously First Avenue North. We have 3 segments that we will be constructing: the west segment, the middle segment, and the east segment. And the east segment, as you can see from our slide, runs from the railroad crossing between North 22nd and North 20th Street, all the way down to just past 9th Street, where 87Y is off there. And that's kind of referred to as the metro area down on that end. And then we're going to be doing a little piece of 13th Street as well, where it comes in from the south to the north. And that will be adding some additional capacity for some turning movements of the signal itself. The second section is the middle segment between North Broadway and the railroad crossing. Or I'm sorry, North Broadway from the railroad crossing to North 22nd Street and North 20th. And as you can see, the west segment would pick up there and go down to Division Street. The sequence of construction would be from east to west. Part of that is due to the hydraulics. Certainly don't want to run the water into an area where we haven't made the hose any bigger to take the water. So the construction sequence will start at the east and it'll go to the middle, and then it'll end up in the west. It's about a total of roughly 2 miles, give or take, and it'll be in 3 different projects. Okay, next slide, please. So the improvements, the roadway itself will be basically torn up, and the sidewalks as well, and the curb and the gutter and the stormwater, and everything will be replaced. We're not adding any additional lanes, so the lane configuration will stay the same. We're not removing any parking. We are basically replacing in kind, building a new facility that will be up to date. So there'll be new curbs, new gutters, everything will be ADA compliant. The condition will be new, of course. We'll be doing stormwater improvements to better facilitate some of those, 100-year to 100-year storms, to get that, to clear the streets quicker. I'm sorry. We're going to be doing new ADA compliant sidewalks. All the crossings will be ADA compliant. We'll be doing on-street parking. This is new on-street parking on our bullet here. And basically, we're going to be replacing the on-street parking. You may see some changes around the bulb outs at the intersections. There may be the loss of a parking spot or 2, but in general, the parking will remain the same for the business owners and for the people using the corridor. New street lighting, if you're familiar with the area, is a little bit of a hodgepodge. Mostly Cobra headlights, which are not aesthetically pleasing, but they are functional. We're going to be going with a new luminaire that should be consistent throughout the corridor. It may look like something like what you see on the left of your screen here. It should be more decorative, consistent, considering a black, like a powder coating would be, if you've been down in the Ebird end on the east side, you'll see similar lights. So we're still in design and discussion as to what that light will actually look like, but that's the luminaire that we kind of have in our mind as a starting point. We're replacing the North 13th Street traffic signal. Like I alluded to, there'll be an additional turning movements and the signal will be upgraded as well. And then we're going to be doing some aesthetic improvements. So when we replace the corridor with everything brand new, we want to make it better than it is today. So want to create a real consistent theme throughout the corridor so it doesn't feel like kind of individual segments. Next slide, please. Here's your two typical sections. They reflect what's out there today. So in the areas where we have a 5-lane section with traffic in both directions and a 2-way left turning lane down the middle, we will continue to have that. And in the sections where we have the 1-way traffic, which you're familiar with in that downtown area, I guess that's the next slide after this one. Here we go. And this is the 1-way traffic, which we've got parking on both sides and a sidewalk that we put varies there. You can figure it's going to be 10 to 13 feet for most of the corridor, real consistent with what you see today. And then as you can see on there, we have drawn in a couple of trees, and a little bit of low shrubbery. That's just to indicate that we are committed to doing landscaping throughout the corridor. And trees are a large part of the discussion on the landscaping because they're visually appealing. They create some shade. Everybody likes trees. So next slide, please. So if you're a pedestrian and you're walking, the cars aren't going to see anything different. They're going to have the same lanes, they're going to have the same parking. They may have a little narrower lanes than they had before, but functionally it'll operate the same. As a pedestrian, we're trying to make it a more welcoming, walkable area, and not just the core downtown portion at the west end, but we'd like to extend that feeling through the corridor. So obviously we're going to have a consistent sidewalk. We're going to replace everything throughout. It'll be a nice walking surface. All the heaves and cracks and seams and missing pieces will all be brought up to brand new. All the crossings will be ADA compliant, like I mentioned. We're considering additional crosswalk locations. There's been a lot of discussion on the east end of the project that there just isn't a lot of opportunities for pedestrians to go from one side of First Avenue to the other. So we haven't identified anything specifically, but as design progresses, we're open to the discussion of logical crossing locations, and what would come with those would most likely be bulb outs to shorten those crossing distances, pavement markings, potentially additional signing beyond our standard signing, and maybe a pedestrian activated flasher. All those things haven't been worked out yet, but they are things we'll consider as we go forward. We'll be doing bulb outs at select intersections. Oop, you jumped the gun. I wasn't done with my last bullet yet. And landscaping the entrance walking experience. Oh, no. So we'll be doing bulb outs and landscaping to enhance the walking experience. As it says here, the bulb outs serve a couple of purposes. And now we can go ahead and please go to the next slide. The bulb outs serve a couple of different purposes. One thing that they do is that they shorten that crossing distance for the pedestrian. So they encroach into what would be considered the parking lane. Obviously, you don't want parking at the corners anyway, because the parked cars then cause visibility issues. So we're not displacing really parking with the bulb outs, but what we're doing is we're pushing those pedestrians farther out into the roadway so they're easier to see visibility wise, and they are also able to cross a much shorter distance than if they would have to stop and start back behind the curb face without these bulb outs. Another thing that we get to do when we put in the bulb outs is aesthetic treatments, stamping, colors, plantings, things like that. Low ground type plantings. We don't want them to grow up and cause visual obstructions as they mature. And then a third thing is First Avenue. During some times in the day, we've heard concerns that the traffic speeds may be higher than people are comfortable with. These bulb outs will create kind of visual friction at these intersections, and they'll narrow up the roadway visually for the driver. And it should produce a more consistent driving experience for the driver as well. So we're hoping that that will be reflected in more consistent speeds and more comfort to the pedestrians, as well as, you know, the business owners and even the cyclists on the roadway and the drivers themselves. So next slide, please. Other aesthetic improvements, trees again, comes up often. I believe it's probably the most common aesthetic treatment that people recognize as having an immediate visual impact. Upgrading the lighting. Visually, those lights will create kind of an identity of the whole downtown corridor. They'll be consistent throughout the corridor. Colored concrete, we've talked about kind of changing up the vast gray concrete space of some of the parts of the undeveloped parts of town, still down to the east particularly. Possibly adding some color to it so it just breaks up that pattern and it makes it more enjoyable as a walking facility. Traffic signal controller box wraps. So those big metal boxes on the corner of every traffic signal, there are a lot of communities wrap those with local artwork or other types of, you know, visual print, and it makes them look that much nicer than the sterile boxes. And then this incorporating of local artwork is just a kind of sitting out there as a concept right now, but as we go forward, I'd like to take a look at, you know, maybe approaching the city council, approaching the community, seeing if there are ways that we can engage them in creating a sense of space and a sense of ownership down the corridor. And all that would do is have benefits and enhance the walking experience and attract people to this area. That still needs a lot of fleshing out, and we haven't. So I want to ask at the end where we're going to put the artwork, because we haven't really identified anything yet, but it's something down the road that I'd like to discuss as we get closer to the end of design. Next slide, please. So parking and public transportation, we've had concerns. Anytime you come into an area that's dependent on people for business, parking is a large concern. And the on-street parking will remain substantially the same. There may be a spot here and there right on the corner that will have to be removed for either the purposes of the bulb outs and the pedestrians or sight distance, or in some cases, with the side streets being converted to two-way traffic, some of those parking spots have to be moved back because vehicles are pulling in where they never did pull in before. They're actually turning the opposite direction onto that street than they have historically. And that will displace a parking spot or two. So you will see a very small incremental reduction in the area of a couple of spots, but we're going to do everything we can to minimize that. Now, public transportation, we've been in contact with the city of Billings, and currently they run First Avenue as a flag stop route, and they would like to go to a fixed stop route. And we're working with them to identify where those stops would be for two reasons. One, we can develop those fixed stops. We can add ADA accessible access points, easier for them to load and unload. And also, if we can identify a good location for a bus shelter, we would like to maybe include a bus shelter in the design and construction of this project in conjunction with transit. There's no bus shelters on the corridor right now. I don't believe there's any fixed stops. So it will be an enhancement to the corridor, bringing in more public transportation. Next slide, please. All right, now this is the part where I get to turn it over to Thaddeus, who is our MDT representative, and he's going to discuss the scheduling and some of the less fun parts of project delivery. Thaddeus.
Thank you, Ivan. So here we have the project schedule, and currently the project is in the early design phase of survey and discussion with the consultant. So we have quite a way to go. We will host another open house when we have updated plans that we are going to share with the public. So as the project moves on, we'll continue to keep everybody as informed as we can. Construction of the east segment from the railroad crossing to North 9th Street, as well as a short portion of North 13th Street, will occur first, and that is tentatively scheduled for 2027. And that's the second row from the bottom on this schedule. So we do recognize that it's 4 years out, and people might expect to see improvements before then, but we are doing this on a schedule that allows for the proper design and getting input. So we do want to continue to hear from people as the project goes along. Construction dates for the project's middle and west segments have yet to be determined, and the schedule is subject to change due to factors such as design complications, funding availability, contractor availability, right-of-way acquisitions, and other unforeseen factors. Next slide, please. And construction duration is still being determined. It is anticipated construction will take multiple years to complete the 3 different phases. And that does have a benefit. Dividing the project into phases allows project segments to be completed sooner rather than waiting to acquire all of the funding needed to complete the entire corridor at once. The project cost is still indeterminate, right? As the final project is designed, we will refine the estimate throughout the design phase. The projects will be funded through the state of Montana's federal aid program. Next slide. So some of the questions that people might have is what happens during construction, and it is too early to discuss details regarding construction of the projects. However, MDT has some basic guidelines applicable to urban reconstruction, regardless of the project. For instance, access to business will be a top priority for MDT, and MDT will coordinate with the construction team to ensure reasonable access to all businesses along First Avenue North are maintained. Regarding traffic, it is anticipated traffic will remain on First Avenue as much as possible. And also of note is that emergency services are going to be prioritized, and communication will be distributed well ahead of the construction dates, so teams have time to respond. Next slide, please. As we can see here, the First Avenue North project is one of many in the area. If you have any questions about these, the project team can provide information and/or share your questions, because we are coordinating projects between the City of Billings, MDT, and Yellowstone County could have other projects that we are coordinating with also. So we've got a lot of projects going on in the area, and we're trying to communicate as well as we can. Next slide. Improving the safety of First Avenue North along with Montana's thousands of miles of state roads and highways is a vital component of Vision Zero. Vision Zero is an ongoing statewide collaboration among agencies and organizations which strives for the goal of 0 deaths and 0 serious injuries on Montana's roadways. We thank you for doing your part to help MDT on this mission by driving safely and responsibly on Montana's roadways. And thank you for your time. I will hand this back to Sloan.
Thank you, team. If you would like to stay up to date on the project's progress, You can do so by subscribing to the quarterly updates via email and text messages. To subscribe for email updates, you just need to email me, Sloan at bigskypublicrelations.com. To subscribe for text updates, you just text First Avenue North, all one word, to 41411. If you have any questions, feedback, concerns, you can contact us at any time by emailing me, Sloan, or calling our project hotline. The contact information is on this slide, so please take note of it. This information is also on the project's MDT webpage, where you can also find more regularly updated project information. So this brings us to the Q&A session. We will now pass it over to Katie.
Wonderful. Thanks, Sloan. Thanks, everyone. It looks like we have at least one comment question loaded up in the Q&A. So for those listening in, if you do have any questions after hearing today's presentation, feel free to type those into that Q&A system that Sloan was mentioning at the beginning. Looks like 2 chat bubbles, and we can make sure that we can address anything now, or you can always follow up with Sloan after this presentation if you feel more comfortable doing so that way. So kick us off, Ivan, I'll turn this one over to you. I'm just going to read this. So Jacob notes, this project seems like a great opportunity, to improve First Avenue as a pedestrian and bicyclist facility. His question then is, why are there no design elements included that would slow traffic speeds to create a more comfortable environment for the non-motorist and to encourage growth in areas of the corridor in need of investment? So, Ivan, any thoughts on that you could share?
Yes, and I'm recognizing the name. I think maybe Jacob had come to our public hearing, our open house last night too. So the project was scoped back in, I think 2015 is when this started, and there was a lot of discussion at the time between the owner of the facility, which is the Department of Transportation, and then kind of if you want to think of them as a co-owner, the city of Billings, as to what the exact scope of the project was going to be. There was discussion about bicycle lanes. Ultimately, they decided not to add bicycle lanes because there are parallel facilities on either side of First that have bicycle facilities that are, I would say, probably more comforting for a cyclist to ride on. Other than that, the roadway itself, the lanes are somewhat dictated by the traffic needs. And this is a national highway designated route, I believe. It's a state route, and it has a certain minimal threshold of traffic that it has to maintain. So that's a restriction put on it. We can't just take lanes away, for instance, and make it a more inviting area. I would somewhat disagree that I would disagree with the statement that there are no design elements included that would slow the traffic speeds. The bulb outs have been shown to be a traffic calming measure. Planting the trees is going to create more of a side friction visually for the driver, and it'll provide a more consistent route. And then the development, these areas of the corridor in need of investment. That is one of the purposes of extending the project all the way to the east, is to create a consistent corridor so that downtown business area will expand in that direction and already have those facilities in place, much like what they have in the downtown area. So as that downtown business grows to the east, we want to already have the landscaping, the treescaping in, the bulb outs, the new pedestrian facilities, crosswalks, things like that. And eventually, if signals become warranted, it would further affect the traffic speeds through that corridor. But there are things that we are not allowed to do by the scope and the purpose of the roadway, and things like eliminating the lanes, for instance, or trying to disperse the traffic out into the neighborhoods. That would certainly make this corridor have less volume on it, but it would cause a lot of induced traffic on the side streets, and as they filter through the neighborhoods, that's not necessarily a positive. And sometimes there's a ramification for constricting these corridors. So It's kind of a long answer, but it was not scoped to be strictly a pedestrian or strictly a non-motorist project. It was scoped to be a project that had all the elements of a transportation facility. And we had to carry that forward. I don't know, Nick, if that's a good enough answer, or Thaddeus.
Thank you, Ivan. I think you hit a couple of good design elements with those bulb outs.
Oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I just agree, Ivan. I think the bulb outs are a key feature for both traffic calming and for the pedestrian crossings as part of this project, so.
All right, thank you, Drew. I think that was really comprehensive, Ivan. I know I certainly learned a couple of things in there too. So if there's, Jacob, if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to let us know. And currently, Sloan, I might turn it back over to you. That was the only question that I'm seeing in our Q&A system.
Okay, great. Maybe we'll just give everyone a few more minutes. I know last night, Ivan, there was some questions regarding the cost to landowners along First Avenue North. A couple of them were stopping by and asking questions about that. Do you just want to touch on that briefly?
Yes, and that's a great point. A lot of the business owners have had significant investments in the new sidewalk and new landscaping, or trying to get ADA access into their buildings as that downtown area has developed. And one of their big concerns has been, are they going to be required to pay for it again? And the answer is no. This project is being paid for with federal aid dollars. It's being built by the Department of Transportation. There's no expectation for the landowner to put in personal money for the replacement of the sidewalks or the landscaping that we're going to be putting in that's designed in there. Furthermore, if you're listening right now and you do own property along this corridor, there is limited opportunities for partnerships, if you will. There's limited opportunities for partnerships where perhaps there is some additional work that you'd like maybe a piece of conduit running underneath the sidewalk to get to your planter that you'd like to plant plants in. Those are things that we may be able to actually incorporate into design and construction if they don't affect the overall project. So we'll be designing what we consider a minimum, and if a landowner wants to expand on that, we would definitely be open to a partnership, but the basics will not require any private participation from the landowners for sidewalk improvements and the new trees that are going in, et cetera, et cetera. And I hope you heard me. It sounds like my headset was cutting out a little. I noticed.
Yeah, no, that came through great, Ivan. Oh, it looks like someone had an issue with it. If you have any more questions, please don't hesitate to put them in the Q&A box. If you need Ivan to clarify anything, or if there's something you didn't hear clearly, we're happy to repeat that. Also, Ivan, another thing that came up with a few concerned citizens with a type of ADA ramps on the sidewalks. Do you want to touch on that a bit?
There definitely was some questions as to what type of tactile warning devices we were going to put down. Were we going to place the plastic type that you see that sometimes has fracture problems and breaks under snow plows and things, or if we were going to go with the stainless, or not stainless, the cast iron devices. There's also questions of, would we be putting them in areas that would be in direct conflict with like their business access, some of the pedestrian buttons that have been retrofitted into these corners don't necessarily lend themselves to snow shoveling around. And when we replace all of that, that's one thing we'll take into consideration, is the maintenance after everything goes in, make sure that they can get their equipment in there. The slide that we showed that had the landscaping elements within the bulb outs. We had some really good suggestions as to maybe native plants in there. Instead of like a commercial sage, could we find a native sage that would grow in there, and it would kind of better reflect maybe some of the people that live in the area. Those were really nice additions to the comments that we got. Trees, there's existing trees that people have planted in front of their businesses. Depending, of course, on the design elements and if there's any utility conflicts. Absent any conflicts, we are going to do our best to maintain those trees. We have some best management practices as to how to hopefully protect them during construction. And if they are torn up, we would be replacing them at the same time. But those were a lot of the things we heard. The bulb outs, the angled parking on the side streets was something that some people have brought up from the two-way conversion, which it's not included in this project, but we will be taking that into consideration when we design our bulb outs. So there won't be any, put it in, tear it out, put it in, tear it out, put it in type cycle. That a lot of times it seems like the construction just never ends in your neighborhood, and trying to accommodate all that with our design also.
Great, thank you, Ivan. It doesn't look like we have any more questions. So that concludes our presentation for today. The presentation was recorded and will be posted on the project's webpage in the next few days. So you can go back and refer to it and share it with family, friends, and neighbors. Again, if you have any further questions or comments, please feel free to reach out to us. And thank you so much for joining us today. And we hope you have a great afternoon. Thank you.